complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
I'm okay. How are you? Thanks for hosting me.
Yeah, I'm doing well. Glad to have you back. So specifically, I invited you on this week because I wanted to talk to you about something that I've heard you mention obliquely. Obviously, you're a lawyer. You trained in law, and specifically on your shows with Pete, talking about Nuremberg, you talk at least slightly about kind of like the rationale of the legal system, essentially like why we do the things we do. So can you give us kind of like a broad overview of your background in law and as well as your interest in it?
Sure. I went to college initially. I mean, I made the point before, and don't worry, I won't make this some huge tangent, but it's important to it's important to clarify. I'm not one of these people who's into institutional education for its own sake. I mean, quite the contrary. I think that should be clear to anyone who follows my content. But 30 years ago, you couldn't you like consumer internet was nascent, and you just didn't have the resources at your disposal that you do today. So if you wanted to really make a study of an academic subject, particularly what the subjects I wanted to pursue, you really needed a university library system, among other things. And I got a full ride to college, so I went to Loyola University because, despite the fact that it's a Jesuit college, in the Jesuit, I don't want to offend anybody, nor do I want to deep dive into some kind of esoteric discussion of the history of the Jesuit order and the Society of Jesus, but they're not exactly right wing or what's considered to be a conservative element within the Roman Church. However, at Loyola University in those days, there was very much a right leaning sensibility in the philosophy and the history department. And that's one of a few universities where you could study political theory for political philosophy proper. Okay, so that's what I did. And that's when I kind of formed my ideas as and obviously, like, I've refined my ideas and things, in the last 25 years, because I mean that's just what you do if you're an educated man. But that was really where my ideas on government, on ethics, on aesthetics, theology, that's where they pretty much ossified. Okay, but I realized, I didn't go to college to get a job certificate or something. I went there because I didn't have to pay for it and because I could study what I wanted to. And I always knew I wanted to be a writer of some sort, in a research capacity, a revisionist, or on revisionist topics. But I didn't, I didn't really know how to monetize that. And again, in those days, you couldn't just promote your brand and put your work product out there, and if it was of high quality, and you could find an audience. It's not like today where you can monetize that way. So I got mostly a full ride to law school as well. You know at John Marshall Law School. That's the only place that offered to give me a break on tuition, so I went there. And I went to law school because not because I wanted to be a lawyer so much, but I mean, obviously, I wasn't going to get a job in something engineering or hard science related, because that's just not where my skills are at. And I came to realize pretty early on in my academic career that the basis of government is law, and particularly in the West, and I mean Anglophone societies especially, but in the West generally, there the underlying theory of government has always been highly juristic, more so than in other kinds of societies. Now, I mean, some people would argue that's because the West puts a premium on reason. I don't really accept that. I don't have that much esteem for the law. Number one, number two, it's not the law itself is not a science, and that's not why. Okay, it's just not. I even if you have a more charitable view of the rationalist tradition than I do, that's not why things are ordered the way they are. But I mean, we can get into somewhat why they are as we move on here. But I started studying law because I was interested. If you want to understand like political philosophy as applied in policy terms and how it structures, social and political life, like that's what you have to study. So that's what I did, and I did a few different things in the law, like in an applied capacity. I mostly worked on the criminal side in post convictions. That's a post conviction appeal it's a collateral attack on a criminal conviction. After direct appeals are exhausted, you can attack a conviction on constitutional grounds. Generally, ever it, and a claim of actual innocence is always timely. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways based on the facts. I mean, depending on what the fact pattern reveals or indicates, there's a lot of different ways you can argue a post conviction appeal. I mean, that's library lawyering, but I like that kind of stuff. So I spent a lot of time with that, and I did some courtroom work on the criminal defense side too, and other things. But mostly, that's not particularly interesting. I mean, I don't think, and also I don't really want to. My own biography is not particularly compelling, but my primary interest in the law and like what I've done in it is, I've written on theoretical topics, and I've written on its application, and the equitable questions raised therein, and that's why right now, in addition to the series I've been doing with Pete Canones on his podcast, which I'm very grateful for, the fact that he's willing to host me in an enduring capacity, and the fact that people have been very supportive of it. I'm writing a book based on the subjects Pete and I have been covering. I mean, I had that in the works before anyway, just because I've written voluminously on it. But I've pared down the form I want it to take. So I'm working on that now, and I think I can have it done by the spring. So I mean, that's basically like my relationship to the law. Yeah, I don't have anything more to add on that.
So one of the things you mentioned that I thought was kind of interesting is you say that the law is not a science. Can you go into that a little bit more? I'm curious what you mean.
Yeah, what I mean is what Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, and for some reason, people on the right bash Oliver Wendell Holmes. I think it's either because they don't understand what he was getting at, or they're accustomed to these kind of pitiable mediocrities, like Sonia Sotomayor, like citing Holmes as purportedly their guiding kind of pole star. But Holmes was a pioneer of legal realism. Okay, now like legal realism isn't like political realism or economic realism or something like that. Okay, what it basically posits is that look, the law in any given epoch, it's going to be informed by policy considerations of an ethical nature or a purportedly ethical nature, of a structural nature, and that any judiciary that's engaged in that's got power of review is going to begin to act like a kind of quasi legislature, and it's going to take its cues from the body politic and from what's fashionable. So you're always going to have a politicized judiciary no matter what. I mean, that's especially bad in America, and especially kind of nakedly corrupt in terms of its partisan leanings. But Holmes's point was that the law is always like decisions are rendered in public policy terms, based upon ideological considerations and based upon political currents and based upon what's fashionable in kind of popular ethics. Okay. And then later and after the fact, a lot of what judges do is rationalizing these decisions, in all kinds with resort to all kinds of tortured logic, suggesting that no, actually, this is there's a formal calculus to the law that just lay people don't understand. When in reality, that's nonsense. And Holmes was right. Now, I mean, there are, in my opinion, Judge Posner, who's a pretty esteemed guy, like where I'm at in Illinois. I'm not a big fan of his, okay, or his body of work, but he's a big law and economics guy, and I do believe that. And again, I'm not going to go on a huge tangent here, but just for clarity's sake, what we're talking about, guys like Posner, I think they proceed in good faith. They really do believe that they're deciding cases, based on metrics that benefit the most persons and the most actors, in the most equitable way possible, while taking into consideration, the impact on all parties involved, in a dispassionate way. And I think they really believe that that's what they're doing. Okay, and I think to some degree they might consciously eschew, being swayed by political currents of any given of any given epoch. But I, at the same time, I mean, even the way questions are presented at law, and even the cases that are granted certiorari and things, I mean that itself owes the political consideration. So essentially, like, the process is corrupted by these things from inception. So that's basically the way I look at it. And also, even anytime you're talking, I mean, aside from all that, even, I mean, let's say there weren't these kind of competing schools of thought on the law. It's not like, what exactly, like, human affairs aren't based on aren't based on formal logic patterns, and they're not, human affairs isn't reducible to science. Like, what people, what the ethics, I mean, yeah, there's universal ethics, that are based on natural law, and, like, truly do derive from reason in the most basic terms. Like, you're not going to find, like, no functioning society would declare that, like, a non-privileged homicide is just okay, and that there's nothing wrong with that, or nothing objectionable about that. But I mean, beyond those kinds of ridiculous counterfactuals and folks make a point, there's not, like, what any given polity, like, what the prevailing ethics are, whether they're organic and come from the body politic, or whether they're imposed from above. Like, these things aren't, they're not based on rational criteria. They're based on when legitimate preferences of that sort. They're based on historical memory. They're based on communitarian values. Owing to experiences that are kind of interstitially bound up with culture in terms of historical memory. They're based on symbolic psychological features of the human mind, like, some of which are universal, some of which are related to discrete cultural experiences. Um, but and if they're if you're talking about a social engineering regime from above, like we have here, and particularly like we've had in earnest since the New Deal regime, though that's not rational either. I mean, there might be a bounded, it might be, such a regime might be proceeding within a bounded rationality as to what it wants to accomplish, is rational in the parameters of its overall sort of objectives. But there's not, that's not rational either. It's really just kind of like an arbitrary aesthetic or ethical preference, or it owes to a political consideration. And politics itself isn't rational. I mean, there's rational actors, okay, within political landscapes, strategic and otherwise, but it's the but like, holding political sympathies, and, like, who is your friend and who is your enemy, like, those aren't rational. Okay, I mean, they owe to things, like, they owe to things like ethno-sectarian loyalty, and familial bonds, and things that are familiar, owing to cultural learning, and owing to instinctive preference and stuff. So, the dominant feature of the law is always going to be sociological. Okay, and even if we strip away those things, and let's say there's a judge who like Posner favors a law and economics sort of analysis, but he was just prone to, like, a pure sort of rendition of that methodology. Okay, I mean, even just even in analysis grounded in pure economics, if there is such a thing, like, economics isn't particularly rational. Okay, I mean, that's why we can't model it, and in any complete terms without reference to the spontaneously ordered price mechanism. I mean, what the consumer prefers is what the consumer prefers. I mean, it's not. I can't just. I can't just arbitrarily assign, like, what the consumer should prefer according to what I consider to be a rational decision making process. I mean, so there's all of those things. So the thing to keep in mind is that the law is always it's always sociologically inclined, and it's always framed by political questions. Okay, and it's not. And finally, I'd say one of the reasons the law, like all professions, has been gravely harmed by technology. I don't mean harmed in terms of its integrity, although that is true too. But there's like less and less for lawyers to do. There's less demand for legal services, and such that there is a demand for legal services. Um, you know, Technology has rendered a lot of what was essential legal work obsolescent. So what lawyers are constantly trying to do is they're constantly trying to dress up what should be not particularly complicated in this kind of overly cumbersome ridiculous language and things, and kind of doing everything they can to kind of keep like lay people out of the loop, so that there continues to be a demand for what they do. So keep that in mind too. Like a lot of this stuff is needlessly complicated and Byzantine for no real reason. It's just that lawyers can pretend like they're engaged in some kind of expert analysis that most people just simply can't grasp, and that's nonsense.
So that was good what you said, and in that you made a distinction between kind of the pre and post FDR regime. You call the post FDR regime essentially a regime of social planning. Can you go into that distinction specifically with how it relates to the law?
Well, yeah. My only point was that, I mean, obviously, even in the 19th century, and I mean even in the 18th century, at the point of the founding of the republic here in America, the law was always framed by political considerations, but what Paul Godfrey called the therapeutic managerial state. I mean, that's very different than what James Burnham and Sam Franz referred to. Godfrey referred to a process wherein social engineering and imposing values on the population that are not only at odds with kind of spontaneously occurring or already extant sort of like social preferences and cultural practices, but that are actively opposed to those things and aiming to eradicate them in favor of either a loosely kind of defined civic identity, or a kind of socially engineered political identity that's based on a kind of punitive view of what it's replacing, and that's not really well precedented, in large part because it just wasn't possible before. But also, the 20th century ushered in a kind of epoch of total politics. I mean, now we're getting into stuff like Ernst Nolde talked about, and Martin Heidegger and things, and Carl Schmitt, when it was familiar to most of the people who are listening to this pod. But so like as the conceptual horizon changed, also so did potentialities of what the state was capable of doing. And not only was the New Deal regime revolutionary, it was just as revolutionary as the National Socialist regime in Berlin and the communist regime in Moscow. But it had the ability to shape human social life and patterns of behavior, as well as the kind of implement to a certain degree, and to a certain degree it's exceeded, but to attempt to implement a program of kind of socially engineering a man who's ideally suited to being governed by according to the terms according to criteria that were most valued by the core decision makers of the regime itself. And so I just make that distinction because it's an important one, whatever we're talking about. But but the law being very very kind of contrived in a sort of a kind of political endeavor, passed off as something scientific like that. That's nothing new. I mean, that's been the case for centuries.
So one of the most common kind of boilerplate shitlib, I guess, complaints about America is that America has this massive prison population. There's too many people in prisons, and that seems to me a fair enough complaint, right? Like there's just a large percentage of Americans who spend a lot of time in prison, but yet nonetheless there are a lot of violent criminals. And you've said before that America kind of fetishizes prison. Can you explain what you meant there, and then also maybe kind of offer some type of like practical solution for dealing with a large violent population without resorting to these kind of eternal prisons?
Well, people don't really understand what I mean by that is this, okay? And like prison is a new concept. I'm not talking about pre-sentence detention. I mean, there's always, even going back to even before the Middle Ages, what's considered the Middle Ages, in terms of the kind of commonly accepted linear timeline. People were always held in detention before they were brought before, the king's bench or whatever, and before a sentence was imposed, usually which was execution, in the case of a serious felony. And otherwise it was some kind of restorative justice or some kind of corporal punishment. But, so people were always briefly held, in detention. But this idea of warehousing people in institutions, post conviction, that's a bizarre concept, and it's not very old. It's only a couple centuries old, and at scale, it's only about a little over a century old. Okay, what it came out of is the Enlightenment thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, who I think was really kind of a grotesque person in terms of what he envisioned as a kind of ideal social regime. But the whole reason why penitentiary is called a penitentiary is because the idea was that within reason, people can be reformed. We're not talking about the absolute worst of the worst. We're not talking about horribly evil people who rape and murder children or something. We're talking about your basic kind of underclass type who commits property crimes or who commits petty violent crimes, for some kind of material gain. The idea was that the overwhelming majority of these people are reformable, and the way to reform them is to stick them in a place where they're kind of forced to reflect upon, moral conduct and their relationship to the absolute. Okay, and in early prisons, actually, there was no talking allowed. Okay, like even in the chow hall and stuff, like you were in a cell by yourself that had a bunk. You were not allowed, and nothing else. You were not allowed to read. You were not allowed any reading material other than scripture. You were not allowed to speak. You'd be let out to some kind of work, usually like farm work or some kind of moderately arduous, like industrial type labor. And then you'd be led back to your cell, and like you'd have nothing to do but read your Bible and sit in silence. Okay, so you're basically forced into this monastic existence. Okay, and even somebody who's like a total knucklehead, that would kind of force them to reflect upon their life and everything else. Okay, did it work well? I mean, maybe not. I suppose it depends on who you ask. There's not a lot of data on this because it's not like data was aggregated in the terms we would consider to be sound, under sound methodology in those days. But that's not really important. For our purposes, that was the purpose of a penitentiary. And that's why until recently, I mean, not recently in terms of the last few years, I mean, in like the last 30, 40 years, parole was done away with. And that's really interesting too. But what happened at some point was basically the idea was that, prison should punish people and should primarily be punitive. That kind of thinking began in the 60s when there was a mass uptick of violence, which endured until the early 90s. That's a really fascinating topic, and it's kind of for another episode, but it did happen. That's not some sort of like Reagan Republican myth or something, okay? But the idea was shifted to, these people they can't be reformed. They're incorrigibles, and prison needs to be punitive. But that's a really weird concept. Like the idea that we're gonna punish you by throwing you in an institution with all kinds of other presumably bad people, and we're gonna do away with any of the kind of penitent aspects. We're just gonna let you kind of mingle with these other bad people. And I'm using the reasoning of the people or the architects of this thing. I'm not sitting here saying everybody in prison is bad. Quite the contrary. I don't believe that. But but the people who shifted conceptually to this idea that prison must be punitive, that's a really weird way to go about it. Okay, and of course all kinds of gross stuff like festers there. Like rampant homosexuality. Like people form gangs. A lot of people in prison are addicted to drugs. So in that environment where people socialize freely and people are constantly moving in and out of the prison, obviously drugs are going to be rampant. Prison basically came to cultivate and allow to fester like all these sort of social ills that supposedly was designed to stamp out of the individual initially. Okay. So it's almost, I think it was almost kind of like a parallel society, like a penal colony. And something really interesting. I mean, one of the primary catalysts for this was the war on drugs. And I'll get into that in a moment. But there's this dude on YouTube. He's like an older guy. He goes by the name Hard Intentions. Like, I don't know the dude, but his content's really interesting. And he did about 40 years in California prisons for murder. He's like about 60 or 70 now. But so he went to prison in the 70s when he was like a 19-year-old kid. And he said that, he's like in the 60s and 70s, he's like in prison, like, it was like the same guys who were always being cycled out of prison. They were like bikers, they were like Mexican gangsters, like in the West Coast, they were like black guys who, were in the dope game and stuff. But he's like, it was kind of, he's like, in some way, you had a weird kind of freedom to that because he's like, the guards understood they were dealing with a certain type of person. And the guys who were in that population kind of knew they were going to end up in prison at some point. He made the point that very suddenly in the 80s, the prison population literally tripled overnight. So suddenly you had all these people who weren't really suited to going to prison, who like weren't career criminals, who really would not have ended up in prison in any kind of more normal society or epoch. Prison just being flooded with them and didn't know how to deal with it. And he said that made things more violent. Like trust plummeted. It created this kind of weird situation between the guards and the detainees where like neither trusted each other and people became unmanageable because, again, like a lot of these people just weren't kind of psychologically capable of handling it. And I'd never thought about it that way before, but that was really fascinating. And he's absolutely right. The prison population during the Reagan administration literally tripled.
Well, to me, it also, and I have no direct experience, but it seems to me, right, that prisons are now kind of also used as kind of like de facto mental institutions.
Well,
right?
yeah,
Right?
that
Kind of
too.
like the post One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest era, where you can't have a mental institution, you can't have a place for, that kind of like homeless and mentally ill. Well, prison, I guess that's the catch-all for that type of person too.
Well, yeah, and especially county jails. Thankfully, I've never been to prison, but like I have been to county jail, and Cook County Jail it's a pretty terrible place, but it's a unique place in terms of how highly scaled it is. But like when I was in the bullpen, there was this guy, and he wasn't intoxicated or anything. He was literally mumbling to himself and shuffling around like this little old guy. And at one point, like he exposed himself and started urinating on the floor. Okay, I mean, obviously this guy's brain was fucking applesauce. Okay, it's like whatever this guy did, which I assume he exposed himself or probably shoplifted something. Like, why is this guy in the county jail? I mean, like, I'm not saying you should be running free among, the public, but like jail is not the place where you put like totally insane people. Like making it a crime to be insane is itself insane. I mean, so yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, thankfully, like I said, I've never been to a penitentiary, but I'm sure guys like this guy are ubiquitous there. But it's also, we'll get into the war on drugs in a minute, but one feature of the modern kind of penal structure is, this idea of locking people in prison for life. That was something that was never done before, okay? Except in very, very, very rare cases where you had somebody who was incorrigibly dangerous and they're, or they were too institutionalized to let out. So just kind of again and again, after their case came up for review, they just were never cut loose. Because the idea of locking somebody in prison until they die is crazy. Like, think about that, and think about a population of guys who go to prison when they're in their early 20s and they draw life without parole. Like, let's say those guys, it's common number of people who live to be in their 90s. So you're talking about 90-year-old men in a penal environment, being shackled in handcuffs, being treated by these like big beefy guards as if they're dangerous individuals. And plus, it's also, there's got to be like there's a time limit to justice, okay? And I'm very much pro death penalty. I mean, not as it's implemented, but I mean like as a penalty. But I'm entirely opposed to life imprisonment. Like, think about this too. Think about the example I just cited. Some guy when he's 21, he commits a homicide. He gets life without parole. Think about that guy lives to be 90. Like, the judge who sentenced him is long dead. The prosecutor who tried his case is long dead. The relatives of his victim are all going to be gone. Everybody who knew the guy in the street's going to be gone. Like, there's going to be like, what's the point of incarcerating this guy aside from the fact you're basically torturing an old man at that point? You know, it's like the time for his punishment is decades gone. You know, like nobody even remembers why he's there, other than if they were, you know, and nobody has any direct knowledge of why he's there unless they were to pull his file, you know, and read through it. But at that point, they're like reviewing a historical record. Like, how is that just? You know, I mean, there's something really sick about it. And
Well, right, and to me, it's the same feeling I get, and this is very much kind of outside the scope of this. But if you ever watched, there's this like subgenre of kind of like truly like ghoulish history documentaries that basically, and they're kind of running out just to as kind of time goes on, but it essentially follows people like storming around the woods of of Argentina trying to find, like escaped, German soldiers and drag them back. This 98-year-old man on oxygen, but we've got to
yeah,
drag him halfway across the world to make him stand trial for something he did when he was 17 years old. And
yeah.
look, like even aside from any like specific moral claim, which I think is outside the scope of this discussion, like it's just on a baseline level, like it's kind of ghastly. Like just like he's old. He's obviously no danger to anyone. Like just let sleeping dogs lie at a certain point.
Well, no, exactly. And it's also too, you know, there's a bizarre thing. Like I don't, you know, one of the reasons why we execute people, and DeMaistre gets into this, and I'm a big fan of DeMaistre's ideas in crime and punishment. But you know, part of the reason is that it allows the condemned to redeem himself too, because like if he goes to his death like a man, that redeems his memory, and that's real atonement. Okay, you know, there's something. It's like we don't, and you know, and I mean maybe because I'm a religious person, like secular humanists will look at me as being flippant about death or something, but you know, like endlessly punishing some guy until he's an elderly man and finally expires like that. We don't no that's highly unjust. You don't torture people for decades, no matter what they did. I mean, if they have to be executed, they have to be executed. We don't torture people for 70 years and claim that that's just. I mean, it doesn't. And plus, too, it means that there's no. I don't like the term closure because it's a stupid term that people it's gonna become kind of this therapeutic buzzword. But there's no like resolution to anything. It's like, I mean, first of all, we don't punish people because victims' relatives demand it, or because it makes people feel good, or allows them to live out some kind of cathartic revenge fantasy against people. Like we punish people because the essence of sovereignty is a monopoly on violence, and the blood of the victims demands it. Okay, but but even if your whole idea is you want people to suffer as much as possible, there's no resolution to just indefinitely incarcerating somebody. It's like I said, like, okay, is this guy just gonna like endlessly languish in prison until everybody's dead who knew him, everybody's dead who knew his victim, everybody's dead who was connected with the trial? Like how does that give anybody, like, how does that allow anybody to move on with their life? It doesn't.
Well, and especially because materially, like, I mean, obviously for the individual involved, there's a difference. But I mean, realistically, if you died tomorrow versus if you got, essentially kidnapped, held away from everyone's view for the rest of time, and no one ever saw you again, like, how much of a difference is that really? Like, I understand, like, maybe it makes, the person doing it feel a little bit better. It lets society feel better about it. But like materially, like how much of a life is living in a box forever? I realize that's easy to say as someone who isn't currently living in a box, right? But it does seem like this bizarre fixation on, well, as long as we're not the ones forcing them up to the scaffold, it somehow makes it seem better.
Well, yeah, and it's also, I mean, I don't think it's okay to torture people no matter what they did, and subjecting someone to sensory deprivation for decades, you're torturing them. And and you're torturing them in a weird way. It's not even like it's not even like it could be rationalized on grounds that, well, this is going to help them, become penitent and come to the knowledge of Christ or something. It's just like bizarre and kind of sick, and yeah, like kind of like a non-solution. But it's also the idea in America of what is a crime is bizarre. Like I made the point before, and I mean the war on drugs really is a Cold War artifact, and it's fascinating how like just absolutely nobody will abolish it. It goes to show you how government will never ever no matter what like scale itself back, even when even when a particular mandate has become obsolescent. But like the idea of narcotics, I'm not talking about dealing large scale narcotics. I'm talking about the idea that possessing narcotics can be a crime, let alone a felony, is totally bizarre. Like I'm not even saying it's like right or wrong. or like I'm not being a crybaby about the fact that I'm a convicted felon at all. Like I'm saying that's totally bizarre. Like a crime is something you do to somebody. Like you can't like possessing drugs that you're going to use can't be a crime. I mean, it's like, and if we're gonna say that, like, okay, well, if we're gonna go the moral route and say that, well, all the only law is the moral law, so all sin is a crime. Okay, but that means that me getting drunk should be a crime. Me stepping out on my wife should be a crime. Like me gambling should be a crime. Me like spanking my kids should be a crime. Like why is like everything is lawful except drugs? Because drugs are they're just like the most horrible thing ever. Like
So,
that doesn't make any sense.
I see your point, and I want to ask you: do you draw some kind of like difference between the system you're outlining and what kind of like the more like libertarian thinkers describe as kind of like victimless crimes? Because on one hand, you could be familiar, or you could be forgiven for thinking that you're kind of making the same point.
No, I don't. It's not. Libertarians come at it the wrong way because what they don't account for things like the secondary effects doctrine, and they define it as like as in terms of positive liberty. My point is that there, a crime is a transgression against a person, whether it's a legal person or an actual person. Okay, there's not any precedent in any society for I mean, even like blasphemy, okay, or like blaspheming against Christ or against the king, like you're slighting the sovereign, and you're potentially encouraging people towards insurrection or sedition by slighting against the sovereign, who is God's representative on earth. So I mean I mean there is another subject to that act, saying that possessing heroin or possessing an 8-ball of cocaine is itself a crime. There's no precedent for that. And if the idea is that all law is the moral law, okay, so why is sodomy not only not a crime but a good thing? Like why can I drink alcohol? Why can I step out on my wife? Why can I go play blackjack? Why is all sin okay except drugs that are just can never be used because they are so bad? That doesn't make sense. That's my point.
I see your point, and to me, it does kind of remind me very much of your point about like the regime of social engineering, right? Where law is almost used as like a series of incentives to kind of modify behavior a certain direction, right? So you see this very, very clearly with prohibition, right?
Yeah.
Where essentially like we want people to stop drinking despite the fact that we want to essentially like get rid of this type of behavior. So we'll just make it illegal, and we'll, basically use that to kind of corral people towards a type of behavior that we want, instead of necessarily for kind of like promoting social order.
Well, no, there's that too. And I mean, I know why the war on drugs was implemented. I don't think it was a good policy, but in 1973, it made sense. Okay, it was a national security imperative owing to certain exigencies of the Cold War, nascent globalism, at least in the Western Bloc. All of these things, the fact that increasingly porous borders were causing drug use to become more and more ubiquitous, and particularly impacted was men of prime draft age, and that's a problem. I mean, it was all of these things, okay? But today, after 1989, that went away. And when I run across people who will say, they believe in like absolute licentiousness of everything, but then they'll tell you that like heroin or cocaine is the worst thing ever. That doesn't make any sense. And also too, yeah, to your point, if like making something illegal, that's not how I don't. It's like, okay, let's say you say that like, okay, heroin ruins people's lives, and it does, so it has to be illegal. It's like, okay, but if you charge a guy with heroin possession, what you're going to do is he's going to get locked in jail, and in most jurisdictions, he's not going to be able to bond out because he can come up with a couple $1,000s. So he's going to sit in jail on a drug charge, and if he can't bond out right away, he's probably going to lose his job. And assuming he does bond out, okay, you're going to subject him to this kind of pretrial probation regimen where he's got to check in, and again, there's a social stigma on that. And a lot of judges, if he can get removed at drug court, they're going to tell him unless he goes away for 90 days to inpatient rehab, they're going to send him to prison. So it's basically like you're going to force somebody to quit their job, abandon their means of making a living, so that they can go, they can go through some sort of state approved program in lieu of jail, and then when they come out, they'll still have, the disposition of their case will be less than a felony conviction, but they'll still have a felony charge on their record. And I mean, that's going to severely limit their ability to make a living. Like, how's this keeping people off drugs? I mean, maybe it's
in an attempt to stop someone from ruining their life, you've ruined their life.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like, yeah, and I mean, it's like also, and it's like, okay, I'll hear the secondary effects doctrine, but it's like, if you're talking about a single man with no dependents who's using drugs, I mean, I mean, using drugs is a sin, and abandoning rationality in favor of debased passion, which is what you do when you're getting high, that's a terrible thing to do to yourself. But crimes aren't just bad things. Okay, they have a very specific definition, and again, it's something you do to somebody. It's not just it's not just a synonym for bad things. It's like stepping out on your wife is a very awful thing to do, but it's not a crime. Okay, any drug use similarly is not a crime. And again, I mean, like I said, I'm sure I sound like a broken record or some boring old guy who's repeating himself, but the point of the war on drugs was a Cold War imperative. It was not because we were so worried about people being addicted to heroin. Like it had a national security imperative. That's why it's the war on drugs. DEA is literally an administration. DEA has a lot more power where the rubber meets the road than FBI does, because an administration means that Congress grants them quasi-legislative authority. That's why the federal narcotics schedule is the DEA schedule. They drafted it. They decided what's on it. I mean, this was a big deal. Okay. And the reason why it came into existence was owing to profound geostrategic and political exigencies. It wasn't just like we're so upset about guys snorting cocaine or whatever that we've got to stop this because it's so horrible. So it's weird when I hear kind of like middle class types who've internalized this idea that the worst possible thing is drugs. Especially, like I said, these are the people who like will go to like a pride parade, or the people will say that there's nothing wrong with like cheating on your wife, or there's nothing wrong with like going to a bar and getting shit faced. Like, I mean, I'm not saying people that sit around and like, I'm not saying those things should be crimes either. But it's weird. It's really, really weird to say those things. Not only are they not bad, but in some cases they're positive goods. But if you like do cocaine, that's the worst thing you could possibly do. Like, why? That doesn't make any sense.
No, I very much see your point. I'm curious, and I know that there's a legal doctrine in Latin that I at one time had to learn and have completely forgotten. But there's also something to be said for the fact that in essentially making unenforceable laws, you sort of, I guess, like rob the authority of the state to a certain degree, right? Because you make laws that the state very clearly cannot enforce. And so it kind of, I guess, like weakens the appearance of power.
Yeah, there's that. And it's also, a guy made the point, not just a guy, I mean, one of the main kind of social commentators, and this was about 20, 30 years ago. It wasn't Christopher Lasch, but it was one of these sociologists who began on the left, but then slowly kind of developed a sort of rightist perspective on social issues. It's not actually illegal to do drugs. Like, I don't want to sound like some Marxist or something, but if you're a wealthy person, or if you've got good insurance, and if you've got no compunctions with doctor shopping, and if you got the money to pay for it out of pocket, you can basically do all the drugs you want. Okay. And nobody's going to bother you about it because you're getting them from a pharmacy. Okay, I mean, your doctor might get in trouble if a couple of his patients turn up dead, and it turns out he was giving them Dilaudid for a backache or something. But people see that, so it's like if you're some like hillbilly doing methamphetamine, or some like black guy who's like strung on dope, we're gonna literally send you to prison for having a tiny bag of your drug of choice. But like if you're middle class, any race, and you can pay out of pocket for your oxys and your Xanax and your Dilaudid and your Soma, like it's just okay. I mean, people aren't dumb in that regard. They see that. So you're basically saying that, if you're poor and if you cop stuff that comes from Sinaloa laboratories, you're a criminal. But if you cop stuff that comes from like the Sackler family, that's okay. You know what I mean? That's not some commie take. I mean, that really is the way it is. So, people are getting, if you want to know why people don't internalize that like drugs are bad, is because that's not really the message. I mean, yeah, middle class people have these goofy ideas about stuff, and don't get me wrong, like addictive narcotics are horrible. But what I'm saying is that your average like kind of midwit or like middle class or poor person, what the message they get is that, you know, basically like if you use street drugs, we're going to incarcerate you. But if you can find a way to do drugs where everything's above board and your paperwork's in order, like you're good. I mean, so that why would people respect the law then? You know, I mean, it's obviously a game. You know, I mean, in their eyes, it's more complicated than that, but that's the way they view it. Yeah.
Do you think that we on the right have kind of placed too much importance on violence or violent crime, or do you think that that's a real thing to be concerned about?
I probably got a skewed perspective because my tolerance for certain stuff is abnormally high. I guess I've literally like lived in the ghetto, and I mean, for a minute, I'm not proud of this, but I'm not gonna be ashamed of it and run from it either. I mean, I was like homeless and addicted to heroin. Okay, I've spent time around in like intimate proximity to really, really, really violent people, and I just always, I mean, part of it is like luck. Part of it is I believe God protected me. Part of it is I'm just good at getting along with people, and like people generally don't want to hurt me. So I mean, stuff like this like doesn't bother me. So yeah, I think people. I think you come off like kind of a puss. Not you, but I think people come off like kind of a pussy if they're like all worried about this. And also, um, it's generally like I said, there was something from the '60s, the early '90s. There really was something crazy underway, and I made the point before that there was like a lot of places in Chicago in the early '90s. Like I would not be able to walk around because I would have gotten like stomped out. And like today, I can do that. I mean, the people there might not particularly like me or like the fact I'm there, but like no one's gonna like mess with me for no reason or try to harm me. But you know, it's in the places where that is a problem. You know, if people had real rights of self defense, and if the kind of natural racial boundaries were intact in terms of social convention, like a lot of this stuff would take care of itself. You know, and you know, I feel obviously for people who got like wives and kids and like the area they lived in, which was once civilized, becomes like, you know, basically an unlivable place for women and children on grounds of the stuff we're talking about. Yeah, that is completely fucked up, and that's a real problem. But like in day-to-day terms, when I hear like the Jared Taylor types talk about quote black crime, that's kind of like a red herring too. It's like, okay, so like the only issue with racial differences is if people are quote, committing crimes or not. You know, like if we're ruled by some hostile ethno-sectarian minority, that's fine as long as they're not committing crimes. Or like China, I always make the point like is the People's Republic of China some like utopia because nobody there commits crimes? I mean, like I don't want to live there. Do you? I mean,
well, right, and it's the same thing where it's just like a bizarre, like univariate lens to look at life. Like, don't get me wrong, like you really can't live a normal life, if there's the baseline level of violence is just too high.
oh
Right?
yeah,
Like, if you're
definitely.
constantly worried about that. I get that, but reducing kind of the entire point of a society down to crime prevention, it's the same thing that libertarians do, where they kind of autistically focus on one axis. You know, and then you're very much right. Well, it's like, okay, well, if crime prevention is your sole like determinant for a good society, then China's the best society there is, right? Because
Yeah,
essentially it's
and
just like a massive plantation of like bugmen, you know, who
yeah, and
just like go
police.
around their lives. Yeah, exactly.
Well, and it's also too, where do these guys who are fixated on crime, like where do they live? Like I literally lived on the west side of Chicago as a white dude with a habit. I mean, I'm not trying to I'm not saying to say like I'm a badass or something, quite the contrary. Like I was all messed up. But it's like that's about the most crime-ridden place in this country. You know, and it's like people weren't like I wasn't like having to dodge freaking people weren't throwing shots at me day and night. They're like trying to chop my head off. It's like where do these guys live? We're like obsessed with crime. You know, like I don't like honestly, like what I got to assume they're just like goofy guys or like reading stuff on the internet or you know like hearing scare stories on the news. And I mean, again, like I said, like if you've got a family and you're like a working guy and you got to live like in some failing freaking environment, you know, which is like being ghettoized rapidly, like that is totally messed up. But these aren't these aren't the guys who are making this point. It's always some like weird guy who's telling me like I don't understand because I'm some kind of like I'm soft on the issue or I'm some kind of like apologist. I don't understand how bad quote black crime is. It's like, bro, where do you live? I live in Chicago. I lived on the west side of Chicago. Like where is quote black crime worse than there? You know, like I don't I don't know. But like I said, I probably got too high of a tolerance for like certain things.
Well, and I kind of see both sides of it because I live in a very safe, nice place now, and I very much enjoy that. But I spent a year in Richmond, Virginia, which is the 10th
Yeah.
most dangerous city in America.
I've been there. Yeah. It's
It
not.
is a hellhole.
Yeah. It's very. Shit gets real there, man. Like definitely. It's
And
no
and
joke.
and it was very because I was living there, and my with the same guy I live with now, and my fiance, she lived in the same area, and it was a really different feeling. Because look, I was in my early 20s. My roommate was in my early
But
20s.
you got a girl
That,
with you, and that changes everything, right?
exactly right. Because
Yeah.
when it's a bunch of young guys and we don't have any money, so it's like, oh no, what are you gonna do? Rob me for my broken phone? Like,
Yeah.
I'll take $50 in my pocket. Like, I don't want that to happen, but like, I mean, okay, it's not the end of the world. So I get that feeling. But I think one of the other things, and I think that this is kind of like a built-in response to Americans. I mean, just due to kind of the genesis of the country, right? It's that, oh, the neighborhood's getting a little bit worse, so we'll just move. We'll get out of town. We'll go somewhere else. Like, it's the white flight thing. And I mean, you see that with essentially every, like even going down to like the colonists, that was kind of like, well, we've had a disagreement, so let's move. And fair enough. Okay, that works when you have the West. You have this like vast, like uninhabited country for you to go out and kind of create, your ideal society. Right. But now, obviously, everything's settled. Like there's pretty much everywhere there is to go has been gone to.
Well,
But if
yeah.
you're constantly in this mode of just flight, you are creating the endless blight. Like there's just like, if everyone who is a decent person just leaves, the moment that there's one, rough house on the corner, like why are we surprised that this like just this like blight is kind of like overwhelming our cities?
No, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, you gotta like we talked about before. Like you can't. I mean, first of all, in practical terms, your point, like you said before, and like you're saying now, and it's a very good point. You can't just run forever, just in practical terms. Eventually you hit the ocean or you hit the wall, figuratively or literally. But also, like, you've got to be a man who can like look himself in the mirror in the morning and not just like run away from everything. And it's like, I don't know, man. Like, I mean, again, like I said, I do not suggest people should not model their lives after mine. And I'm a confirmed bachelor. I've also lived a weird life. I mean, and the bad things that happened to me have been virtually 100% my fault. But you know, you do one of the problems with the white man. There's two things. Okay, the white man walks alone, and he's got to be okay with that, and that's one of our greatest strengths, frankly. You got to be able to do that unafraid, and you've also got to carry yourself like the master caste. Okay, and if you can do that convincingly, and it's not like an affectation, it's amazing how non-white people respond to you. It's like intrinsically they respect you, and they realize that there's like lines they can't cross. It's not like being a badass or like being some like MMA wrestler or some karate man or whatever bullshit people are do these days. It's a psychosocial thing, and it's what you're able to cultivate in your inner life and project into the world, and that's how that's how you can impact other people, and bend them to your will sounds corny as well as punitive, but it's how you can persuade them to abide what you wish for them to do and how you wish for them to respond to you. And I mean, I've made a habit and a study of Peckerwood mind tricks, and that's why I'm still here. That's why I get along with everybody at distance. Obviously, this doesn't mean that we become good buddies with our hood rat neighbors, but I do know what I'm talking about. I speak from experience, and the master caste cracks the whip when he has to, and he's benevolent when that's warranted. What he doesn't do is run away and bitch about it like some freaking middle class fairy.
It's interesting what you were saying earlier, and I largely agree with what you said about kind of the restrictions placed on kind of like people's ability to organize themselves and kind of natural self-defense. Because I was talking about this last night with some of the guys in my my Telegram, and basically talking about like the difference between kind of like a national project and an imperial project. And a good friend of mine was talking essentially about how the Ottoman Turks organized their empire. And then the system, as far as I understand it, of ethnarchs, where essentially there is kind of a community representative And look, like the advantage to an empire is you kind of, as long as everyone, kind of, doesn't really challenge the head power, people can kind of be left to govern their own affairs. And
Indeed.
so long as essentially, Greeks aren't breaking into Turkish homes and stealing their flat screen televisions, to kind of mix our metaphors here, right? There's no problem. And if there is a
Right.
problem, well, the Turks have their own laws, the Greeks have their own laws. And if there becomes kind of a conflict between the two, well, the ethnarchs set that out. And kind of
Yep.
having that kind of system where it's a little bit like relations are more formalized versus this just like bizarre, like one-sided free for all. I don't know. Maybe I'm naive, but that seems like a much more workable system.
Well, no, that's also the only way multiracial societies can work. I mean, it's that's correct. I mean, in ethical terms, I believe that's laudable and sensible. But in purely pragmatic terms, that's like the only way. That's like the only way it can work. So yeah, I gotta wrap up here soon. So what else did you want to cover? We can record later this weekend again if you wish.
No worries, man. I think I've pretty much gotten everything I wanted to say out of the way. So can you get your plugs out before we wrap this thing up?
Yeah, man, I am happy to do so. You mentioned T-Gram, like our T-Gram channel, like me and all the fellas. We've got a reactive T-Gram channel, which is dope, and it's really blown up lately. That's not me patting myself in the back. I'm really happy about that because we've got a lot of really really dope people congregating there and dropping some really cool original content. But it's t.me/the7 HOMAS 777. That's the 37 Mafia T-Gram channel. You can find my long form and my podcast. I drop a podcast every 2 weeks. It's called Mind Phaser. You can find my Substack at real Thomas777.substack.com. That's pretty much it. I'm on Gab at real Thomas777. But those that and on Gab, like I back up stuff like I'll like when you and I record and like this goes up on YouTube, like I'll post that on Gab and other stuff. So that's kind of like a place you can, if nowhere else, you can find like my stuff posted. But that's basically where I'm at right now. I'm launching a YouTube channel this month. I got a bunch of sexy hardware coming on Monday and the rest of next week. But it's gonna be Thomas TV on YouTube, and that's gonna be very cool. And oh yeah, the second volume of my science fiction brain, Steel Storm, is dropping imminently through Imperium Press. So be looking out for that. And if you like what I do, please buy it. Because that's how we keep the brand going. We don't solicit donations or anything like that. Any cash I get is for content from subscriptions and from people buying my books. So if you like what we do here, subscribe. It's only $5 a month to the Substack, or buy my books, and that's the way to support it. And thank you very much for hosting me, man. And like I said, we can record more this weekend if you want.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All of your links will be down in the description of this. This will also be going up on Spotify, so y'all can find this stuff there too. As far as my stuff, this will be coming out shortly after my appearance on UO with Academic Agent, so hopefully we'll have a lot of new people watching it. My Twitter, my Telegram, all of that will be linked as well. And if you guys would appreciate it, while Thomas does not take donations, I definitely do. So there's a link for that as well. And thank you guys for coming out. And remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night, everyone. 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 Good night, everyone.